Steven, thank you for joining me on the show today.
It is great to be with you.
You are introduced to anybody who doesn't know you, who I'm talking about, is the flow guy. And that usually prompts a lot of questions that allow people to dig in a little further. So before we get started, I'm just curious, like, is that a fair assessment of a title that you should hold?
I, in my mind, no, but that's a huge chunk of what I do. You know what I mean? When I think of my career, I think of my career as a career that's been spent studying those moments in time impossible becomes possible. And whenever you see that, you see two things happening. You see people harnessing disruptive technology. So 6 of my books have been on disruptive technology. And that was, as a reporter, I spent a lot of time covering that. And you see people optimizing human capability. And when you see people really optimizing human capability and going after higher goals, flow is always in the mix. And, I also run the Flow Research Collective. So we do study the neurobiology of flow. So it's not in an appropriate title, but I run a dog sanctuary. I do a lot of environmental work. Blah, blah, blah. I write novels that have nothing to do with flow. And, so there's a little bit more going on, but I don't mind being the flow guy. I worked really hard to become the flow guy.
Yeah, I mean, I've been the paleo guy and then the keto guy, and I don't know what I am now, but I understand how the individual identities can get really simplified publicly. But I mean, what is, like, if somebody were to ask, what is flow? I mean, it sounds like such a spiritual woo-woo term, like non-quantifiable. So just curious, like sort of your definition.
Yeah, that's exactly why I got into it, right? To really help try to put flow science on a hard science footing. Flow, I don't have a definition of flow. There is a scientific definition of flow, and it's got some layers to it. So at the common, like, how do we define it? It's defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of rapt attention, total absorption, where you get so focused on the task at hand, everything else just seems to disappear. Your sense of self will get very, very quiet. Time will dilate, which is a fancy way of saying it passes strangely. Sometimes, occasionally, it'll slow down. You get that freeze frame effect, maybe in a car crash. More frequently, it speeds up and 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. And throughout, all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof. That's sort of that's the standard colloquial definition of flow and how we talk about it. Psychologists define flow by 6 core characteristics, phenomenological characteristics, meaning the state makes you feel this way: complete concentration in the present moment, the vanishing of self, which I mentioned, time dilation. There's a sense of control, like you have control over performance, goes through the roof, and you feel like you can control things you normally can't control. The experience is autotelic, which means it's incredibly intrinsically rewarding, and we love it, and we'll go out of our way to get more of it. And the merger of action and awareness. So those, when psychologists define flow, and when we measure flow using psychological instruments, those are the, like, in this experience, did you feel complete confidence? And then neurobiologically, which is the work that I've been focused on, flow is defined by very specific changes in neurodynamics. And we've gotten it to the point, there's a ton more research to be done, but we're now can link flow to certain very clear physiological signals. We're getting a better picture of like heart rate variability, but it's even down to using face reading software. There've been a couple studies that have found that your frown muscles tend to be paralyzed a little bit in flow. That's, by the way, not a signal of you can't be unhappy. You actually can't be unhappy in flow. It doesn't happen. But frown muscles are a signal of work, effort. And so in flow, because it's often described as effortless effort, that's why it's called flow. One experience, one decision flows seamlessly, effortlessly from the last. You don't feel that work, so your face does not show frowning, and instead smile muscles seem to be hyperactive. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that stuff. I don't think you can definitively say anything with that stuff yet, but we're getting closer and closer and closer. We've got some new work coming out on the onset of flow that found 4 different neurological signals that people haven't sort of correlated with flow before. Work isn't yet published, so we'll see how it holds up to scrutiny and other people beating on it. But we're getting very, very, very close to a biophysical signature.
Yeah. So what got you into this stuff originally? Was, like you said, you were doing some journalism and you just discovered this, or was it?
So it was a combination of two things. One, I was or more sort of impossible feats got done than ever before. And I was trying to figure out why this was happening. How was it that these people were pulling off stuff that really for the hundreds of years people have thought the human body couldn't take or wasn't physically possible. And so I was doing that. And then I ended up getting very, very sick with Lyme disease. And I ended up inadvertently using flow to sort of heal myself. And I'm a science guy. Like I was like, how the hell can a state of consciousness heal an autoimmune condition? That didn't make any sense to me. And there were other things going on. And those things came together. And what I started to realize is that the same state of consciousness that had gotten me from seriously subpar back to normal was helping normal people go all the way up to Superman. And it was two sides of the sort of same coin. And that's where it started for me. And I came in because I was mostly a neuroscience reporter as a writer. I came in through the neurobiology, and the people I got to know in the field were all the people who were studying kind of this is your brain on flow from different aspects. So that's where I sort of started with it.
So can anybody achieve this state, or is it, I think that some people probably associate, the highest performers are getting here. It must be an innate genetic thing. Like they can dunk basketball. I can't do that.
It's not a genetic thing at all. It's an evolutionary thing. We are all hardwired for flow. This is one of the clearest findings in flow science. This research goes back to the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 70s. Like flow is a universal. It shows up in anyone, anywhere, provided certain initial conditions are met. And it's how evolution, the reason you always see it when the impossible becomes possible is it's how evolution shaped human beings to perform at their best. So everybody's hardwired to flow. In fact, one of the mistakes that people make and this is where flow confuses most people, is they don't realize that it is a spectrum of experiences. It's not a singular experience. So take emotions, anger. You can be homicidally murderous or a little annoyed, and it's the same emotion, just different ends of a spectrum. So I mentioned there were 6 core psychological characteristics. They can show up really quietly, right? And so this is what's known as microflow. And this is an experience that's very, very common. You sit down to write that email to a colleague or a friend. It's supposed to be a quickie, short thing. And you get sucked in and you end up writing an essay, and you look up an hour later and you didn't even know time had passed. And maybe you didn't lose your sense of self-consciousness, but bodily awareness was diminished. And when you pop back in, you're like, oh God, I got to go to the bathroom really badly. And I didn't know before, right? That's microflow. That's very common. In fact, studies have found that we spend about 5% of our work life in microflow, often without even noticing it. Macroflow, other end of the spectrum, is such a powerfully strange experience. Time slows down, things like that happen, that people until the 1950s thought it was a mystical spiritual experience, and it was categorized that way. And then Abraham Maslow was studying high achievers and found that flow and ways to put themselves into flow and use the state to maximize both quality of life and performance was very, very common in his study group, but everybody was an atheist. So spiritual experiences went out, and suddenly he renamed them peak experiences. And then Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came along and renamed them flow, because it was an actual description of how the state felt. And when he was doing his giant initial study on flow, people kept using the term to describe how the experience felt. And it happened over and over and over again. This enormous study with tens of thousands of people, that's where the term came from.
What do you think the evolutionary advantage was? Is it hunting and getting more food? Was it inventing?
Yeah. So the first part is pretty well established. The second part, there's more and more support for it, but it's a theory that myself and a bunch of other people have been advocating for. It seems like in beginning, it's exactly what you're talking about. It emerged as access to either, because at the front end of a flow state, you get massively heightened pattern recognition, which is incredibly good for hunting. Right? A lot of hunting is and you also get pain relief, right? Depending on which neurochemicals are involved, you get considerable pain relief. So for a hunter, you're getting better hunting acuity, plus you can run longer distances, right? Humans evolved to run down their prey, and we can run longer distances than pretty much any other species. So the thinking is, and there's starting to be decent evidence for this. There's been some work on it, that flow was just simply that. It was runner's high, right? It was, we're going to give you a little more pain relief so you can chase down your prey. More prey means more meat, healthier families, more children, et cetera. That's an evolutionary advantage. What really seems to have changed things is So flow crosses species lines. Most mammals have the software to produce flow. And we know dogs get into flow and wolves get into flow and horses get into flow. And there's horse rider group flow and there's human canine group flow. So about 40,000 years ago, we teamed up with wolves. They became our hunting partners and our babysitters and our garbage disposals. And it was a huge it was a huge driver of human evolution. There's a lot of tremendous research around this. But if you I run a dog sanctuary, and my wife and I, and we do hospice care and special needs, and we use flow as part of our healing protocol. I run in the backcountry with big packs of dogs. And if you're not in flow when you're running with a big pack of dogs, everybody trips over everybody. But when you're in flow, suddenly like you drop it. This is why like the Navy SEALs use flow so much, because it drops you get heightened pattern recognition, you get good group coordination movement without needing verbal communication. So it's good. It's really good for that. And if you think about hunting, like you're trying to take down a buffalo with a pack of wolves and all you got is a spear and there's no medicine. And if you fall and get a scratch, you could end up with gangrene and die, right? So there's no margin for error basically when you're hunting large game with a pack of animals. So group flow seems to have really driven forward as a form of like nonverbal social communication, which is often what it's used for today. So it started out as like pain relief is the thinking. And then this was the thing that really drove it widespread in the species. Could be wrong. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to do evolutionary biology, as you probably know, right? So you're always worried that you're just making up a fable. And some of the early evidence for what I just said to you, the evidence still holds, but some of the things that they discovered don't hold. So there was a really funny study done at the University of Arizona where they taught ferrets, dogs, and humans to run on treadmills, and they ran them into runner's high basically. And then they did a lot of blood work and things like that. And they found anandamide in both the humans and the dogs, and they couldn't find it in the ferrets. So the thinking was, we've known for a while that you need anandamide to produce flow. So the thinking was, it's a social mammal thing. But now we know that anandamide, which is part of the endocannabinoid system, is present in all mammals, and that whatever they were looking for, like it's got to be in ferrets because anandamide production goes really far back. It's sort of a second immune system, and almost all mammals have it. So,
have you hunted yourself?
No, I'm not a hunter.
Interesting. I started 2 years ago, and the first time I went out, I noticed a very much flow state. Just going like within 15, 20 minutes, it was insane. Like the way I was just scanning the horizon and looking through things and not paying attention to anything other than where my eyes were and like what was moving around.
What tipped me off, so there's a guy named David Abrams, who's sort of a phenomenologist. He's a philosopher and he's a phenomenologist, and he sort of works on the natural world. And he wrote a very famous book 15, 20 years ago called The Spell of the Sensuous, that was literally about kind of the mindset that hunters, especially he had done a lot of work with kind of native hunter-gatherer peoples, like how they got into the mind of the animals they were hunting and their experiences. And I was reading this book and I'm like, they're just talking about flow. This is flow. This is like group flow. I'm literally reading descriptions of hunters in group flow. And because I was running this animal sanctuary, we were using group flow with the dogs. We didn't know there was going to be a medical benefit. When you run an animal sanctuary, you have a large pack of animals. If you're dealing with, we do hospice care and special needs care. So we get very, very sick, late stage cancer, heart disease, one eye, two legs, you know what I mean? Like blah, blah, blah messes. And if they don't get adopted and like accepted into the pack very quickly, it's like showing up at a new high school, right? Like everybody's mean to you until you get accepted in the pack, and you've got to get the dogs in the pack really quickly because you have a dog that's been very abused. He isolates from the pack, bad things happen. They can go downhill very, very quickly. And I started to realize that group flow, you get all the social bonding chemicals in group flow, right? They all show up very, very quickly. And I started to have the suspicion that if I could take a new dog and the old pack and like take them out in the backcountry and run them into a group flow experience together, maybe it would increase social bonding, right? And I would have less of a problem with these dogs being isolated. That was the initial experiment I was running. And it turned out to like, suddenly it worked really well for that. And we started seeing massive health benefits and things like that spun off of it, which now, I had that experience early on. And We know why flow boosts the immune system. This is a lot of Herb Benson's work at Harvard. He did the initial work on it. And then there's been a bunch of neuroimmunology since that has looked at it. So we now are understanding the health effects of flow a little bit better. Back when I was doing this work with the dogs back in like 2012 and 13, it wasn't fully established yet. But we were seeing it and I was like, this is amazing. This is great. We're keeping dogs that should be dead in a month alive for a lot longer. And there's good bonding and blah, blah, blah. But it's now become a real part of our healing protocol.
It's amazing.
With the dogs.
Something really interesting that you'll probably be like, oh yeah, duh, is that I was doing this big yearly review. I have this extensive review. I look back towards the last year, what things were energizing, what things were draining, like sort of a common thing that sounded very simple that I wanted to incorporate more of this year was being outside, doing activity, usually with a ball and other people. So it's like playing basketball or spike ball or pickleball or tennis or whatever. Like that was like the highlight of my last year. And I think in the past I would have judged it and be like, oh, that's just so simple and wasting time or whatever. But it sounds like it's probably the same exact mechanism that you're talking about.
Yeah. So let me, you're going to laugh. When we work with clients at the Flow Research Collective, very early on, one of the first things we have people do is, so everybody has what is known as a primary flow experience. This is often just whatever that thing is for you. It's outside with a ball and other people, right? Like perfect. Like where like you've probably did it a lot as your kid. You found it really enrapturing, then it sucked you right in and it's really close flow. And these are the very things for the reasons you listed that as we become adults, we edit them out of our life. We have wives and children and husbands and careers and put away the skateboard, put away the surfboard, stop going out and dancing to hip hop, stop wasting your time out in the garden, do your job kind of stuff. And here's the reason we have people reboot their primary flow activity. We tell people to try to get at least like an afternoon a week in. You can break it up into, right? But there's three things that are really important about flow for this. One, as we move into flow, there is a global release of nitric oxide. It's a gas that's signaling molecules everywhere in the body. What it does is it flushes the stress hormones out of your system. And this is why flow works for autoimmune conditions. An autoimmune condition is essentially the nervous system going haywire, as you probably know. And so when you flush all the stress hormones out of the system, it can reboot to homeostasis. It can find normal again, which is one of the problems after an autoimmune condition. You don't know where your body can't find normal, can't find homeostasis. So it keeps bouncing all over the place. That by resetting the nervous system, it just calms you down. So for most people, especially if we're coming off a year like we've all had, right, where everybody's running hot, being able to just reset the nervous system to zero, get the stress hormones out of your system and get some positive feel-good neurochemistry in there, that's really important. More important is this. Flow is a huge boost. When we talk about optimal performance, and I could go through all the studies and who came up with these numbers. They're huge and they sound crazy, but we see a motivation productivity in some studies will be boosted 500%. Department of Defense found learning accelerates 240 to 500% in flow. There's a bunch of different studies, including stuff we did, that shows that creativity and innovation, 400 to 700%. You get well-being, meaning and purpose metrics go up, cooperation, collaboration, a bunch of other things go up. We can talk about why flow would amplify with all that stuff in a second if you want to know, but it's a huge boost. And what the research has shown is two things. One, that heightened creativity I spoke about. This is work done by Teresa Mobley at Harvard. She found that 400 to 700% boost in creativity you get in flow, and this is all aspects of the creative problem solving, will outlast the flow state by a day, maybe two. So you go play, a stickball outside on Monday, drop into a flow state, and not only have you reset your nervous system, but you're going to have massively heightened creativity and innovation for a couple of days. But the most important reason is that flow, not surprisingly, is a kind of focusing skill. It's a way of paying attention to the task at hand. It's similar to mindfulness, like related in the same, network. And I can tell you specifically which parts of the brain are more active in meditation and breath work than in flow. And there are differences, but similar, but much in the way that you train mindfulness, you train flow. Flow follows focus. It's a focusing skill. So by getting into flow Monday, playing stickball or whatever, your likelihood of getting into flow on Wednesday at work is much more heightened because you're training the same skills. So you get and because flow feels so good, and it tends to, reboot things like motivation and enjoyment of life and well-being, and that carries also, it's the simplest fix. I always tell people, and this is something, by the way, I learned the freaking hard way myself, right? It took me forever to get over that thing of, dude, why are you going skiing? You should be working. You should be writing. You should be right. And any list of the world's leading experts on this stuff is going to include me. And it's still I think I was probably almost 38, 39 years old before I was like, you know what? I am going to go ski. I'm going to hurl myself down a mountain twice a week, either on skis or a mountain bike, no matter what. And it became it's first on my list. It's the most important thing I do is that. And that I'm a workaholic. I'm famous for getting up at 4:00 in the morning and working till 7:00 every night. But when I'm not, I still take 2 days a week and go hurl myself down mountains because it's the best thing I can possibly do for my career.
How long did it take you after you started doing that to notice a compounding effect? Because when I do meditation, for example, every day for a month, I don't really notice anything. But if it's 3 months, 5 months, then I'm like, oh, okay, I'm dropping in.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So one thing, big framing things before I answer your specific question. When I say peak performance, all I mean is we're getting our biology to work for us rather than against us, right? And because it's a biology, it's a limited set of tools, right? So there's a bounded set of stuff that we can talk about. And one of the reasons it's so damn hard to train this stuff is, one, it's not all that sexy, right? It's not I always tell people there's nothing I do is going to get you laid when you talk about it in a bar on Friday night. Maybe the success that comes from it is going to, but it's not. So most people, they want a whiz bang technology. They want a fancy substance or something to play with or whatever. And I'm using literally evolutionary psychology stuff that was created millions of years ago. It's very, very simple. The other side of it is it works like compound interest. So people, because flow is so addictively pleasurable, right? The autotelic component, an end in itself. If you return to your primary flow activity, it tends to produce a lot of flow, especially right at the beginning until you start getting into the progression again. And then you start doing what everybody does, which is you get your flow comes along with where your skills are at with the thing you're doing. But at the beginning, you'll get a bunch of flow just for returning to it. And for things like, mood and things along those lines, that's almost immediate. You'll get that within, a couple of weeks kind of thing. But as far as the longer, I thought it was probably about a year before I really started to notice how I'm rating this entirely based on deeper flow states while writing, right? That showed up because that's the most important thing I do all day. And those started consistently going up after probably 6 months to a year of really doubling down on the action sports stuff. But there's focus benefits and there's more flow, but it's like a macro flow thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it builds up over time and things like that. But I think for the well-being, meaning, purpose, that sort of stuff, if you can get over the guilt, right? You have to be able to get past you have to start treating those other activities as I am actually doing the best thing I possibly can for myself. Not feel, because doesn't matter how good you feel going skiing, if you come home and your husband starts yelling at you because he thinks you were fucking off while you were skiing, and you feel guilty about it, right? Whatever benefit you're getting to your nervous system and everything else, it just got shattered. So you know what you have to. I always tell people when you're doing the flow work, it always helps to have your conversations up front. So because otherwise it really like, it really does look like that. And,
Yeah. So, I mean, this is just such a hilarious conundrum that the people who probably need it most, who are workaholics, type A, like folks like me, it sounds like you are the ones that are probably in this guilt trap about actually doing it.
Well, we along these lines, when we train peak performers in recovery, having an active recovery protocol in place, not just passive recovery, it is the hardest with type A players because, when you take somebody who wants to work all the time and say, look, you will get so much more out of your work life if you take 20 minutes a day and go into a sauna or an Epsom salt bath or do restorative yoga or a breath work mindfulness practice that will, reset those kinds of restorative practices, or a long walk in the woods for that matter. Peak performers feel like they're wasting time.
Mm-hmm.
So we train recovery as a grit skill. When you're dealing with peak performers, most of them have to learn that recovery is a grit skill because it takes grit to stop working, right? So, and that's worked for us very well.
So you talked about when you did it 12 months or so, it started impacting and really spilling over to your writing and other work. Was there something that you did intentionally after you got the momentum to drop in before writing, or was it once you got in, it started speeding up? Was it?
So flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. There are 22 known triggers, 12 individual triggers that'll drive me into flow or you into flow. And then there's group flow, right? Just the collective shared experience of flow. It's a fourth quarter comeback in football or a great brainstorming session. There are 10 of those. There's probably way more triggers, by the way, but this is just what people have discovered so far. And it's a lot of different people have worked on this stuff. We did a little work, a bunch of other people have done this work. So I do a ton of stuff, an absolute ton of stuff to ensure that I'm in flow when I'm writing. And it's a fairly long list that takes advantage of all the triggers. And I don't know which, like I was at the time I started, this was sort of a time when I made a really big change. I moved from the city where I'd lived my entire life, or most of my life, back to the mountains, and very rural. And I did it when I was about 39 years old. And so everything got changed. And I really took almost all the stuff that we're now using the Flow Research Collective and started implementing it, because it was around that time that I decided that I was going to really dive deep into the science and the research to a level that I hadn't before. I mean, I had, but not this deep.
Yeah. So was nature part of it? I mean, I've also noticed that we just got some land out east of Austin to do some farming. And every time I'm out there, it's the same thing. I drop in, not being outside of a city. So it's curious. What are those?
Yeah. So nature, there's probably a bunch of other stuff going on when you're out in nature that does it, but there are a bunch of different things going on that we know about. So we won't go too deep into the science, the flow triggers, but flow follows focus. It only shows up when all of our attention is task at hand, and right here, right now. So all the flow triggers drive focus into the present moment, and they do it one of three ways. One of the big ways they do it is by driving I'm losing my voice. Driving the neurochemical dopamine into our system. Dopamine's a feel-good pleasure drug, but it's a big focusing chemical. And when it's in our system, we pay a lot of attention to things, and we want to make meaning out of things. And we're very excited about the things we're paying attention to. Dopamine shows up when we're curious about things, for example, or passionate about things. And so novelty, complexity, and unpredictability are very, very common in nature. Right? And novelty is a huge dopamine trigger. Complexity refers to like perceptual vastness. You overlook the Grand Canyon, something you're thinking about geological time, and you're dropping into awe. Awe is roughly the front end of a flow state. Similar things going on in the brain, time dilation, you get totally absorbed in the present moment. That's being triggered by complexity. It's basically, there's so much information coming in that your conscious mind, which can only really hold on to like 4 big ideas at once, basically gets overloaded, and it passes it over to the subconscious for further processing. That's sort of what's happening in awe. And that's what a reaction to complexity. Unpredictability, I don't know what's going to happen next. These are really common in nature. Sometimes it's, you don't know what bird's going to fly across your vision next, or sometimes it's, you're out skiing and holy shit, the slope just slid, right? Avalanche, right? Nature is packed with those triggers. So that's very, very common. We also know that, and this is not my work, this is Dr. Andrew Huberman's work at Stanford, but we do a lot of work with Andrew in his lab. Flow, one of the biggest flow triggers most important flow triggers is what's known as the challenge skills balance, right? And the idea here is flow follows focus. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch your skills to sort of the utmost, but you don't want to snap. And what this really is a tightrope between boredom and anxiety. Boredom, there's not enough stimulation here. I don't care. I'm not paying attention. Anxiety, whoa, way too much, right? And that whoa, way too much has a physiological neurobiological signature, right? A lot of norepinephrine, a lot of cortisol. That will block. Little norepinephrine useful for flow, too much blocks flow. So anything that lowers anxiety really helps you tune the challenge skills balance a lot and sort of like stay focused on the task at hand. And it turns out one of the quickest ways to activate parasympathetic response and calm down is peripheral vision. So anytime you're looking at a wide vista, right? If you think about fight or flight, what it is it's pinpoint focus, right? Really extreme focus on the thing that's right in front of you that could be, right? And so what happens is when we look at really wide vistas, your brain goes, oh, really wide vista, there must not be a threat directly in front of you. So we're going to calm down, right? Works the same way if you know anything about respiration work. Usually when your exhales are longer than 7 or 8 seconds, you automatically calm down. It's the same mechanism. The brain goes, oh, dude, really long exhale. There must not be any threats around. I will stop wasting all that energy producing cortisol and norepinephrine. This might be a calm situation. So there's that kind of feedback exists in the brain and the eyes, and will calm us down very, very quickly. And nature gives us opportunities for peripheral vision a lot more than kind of regular living in our house and staring at screens. You're narrowing everything. So nature in itself is widening it out. And that alone, that's one of the reasons why nature bathing, quote unquote, I hate that term, but that's why it works. It's one of the reasons why it
forest
works.
bathing.
Yeah, makes me want to punch people. But okay, you call it just whatever you need.
So what does that practically look like for you when you're dropping into writing, for example?
Okay, so let me talk to you about how this works with writing. So I got to talk about one other flow trigger for my writing protocol to make any sense. Two things, actually. One, point out that the science shows that complete concentration is a flow trigger, right? So what does that mean? 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration is actually what the human body is built for. In the same way that REM cycles, 90 minutes long, like your sleep dreaming cycle, we have waking cycles that are roughly 90 minutes long. So we train people to start their day, go after your hardest task, your most important thing. For me, it's writing, with a 90 to 120 minute period of uninterrupted concentration, practice distraction management. So shut off anything that could pull you out of the thing that you're doing. That's one thing I have to tell you. And I also have to tell you that insight or pattern recognition, when you connect two ideas together, you get a little burst of dopamine. This is familiar to anybody who's done a crossword puzzle, right? You get an answer right, you get a little happy juice, that's dopamine. And dopamine is interesting because besides making you happy and heightening focus, it amplifies pattern recognition, right? So you get dopamine from pattern recognition, but what it also does is it tunes signal to noise ratios in the brain. So we detect more patterns when it's in our system. This is why schizophrenia, where you're seeing patterns or conspiracies, paranoia all over the place, is dopamine production over the top. The more dopamine, and norepinephrine works a little bit this way too. It tunes signal to noise ratios. So there's a threshold, right? This is where we normally are, goes up in flow a little bit and goes over the top in schizophrenia. This is also why people who do, dopamine drugs, cocaine, can sound super crazy paranoid when they're on a coke rant. It's the same mechanism. They're seeing conspiracies and patterns where there are none. Or if I give you L-Dopa, the drug for dopamine, and then show you facial images. Some are whole actual people's faces, and some are like your nose, my ears, and my wife's eyes, and scramble them up. You'll note you'll call more fake faces real faces. You'll find more signal and noise than without L-DOPA. But this is what creative ideas spiral. One good idea leads to the next, leads to the next. It's because the dopamine is helping them. So all that aside, I start my writing session at 4 o'clock in the morning. I've practiced distraction management ahead of time, so everything's turned off. I even keep the lights off in my office at 4 a.m. And all I look at is my words and focus view. And if you work on Microsoft Word, you know that all you get then is blackness and your page. So complete concentration, phones off, emails off, everything's turned off. And I start writing by reading and editing what I wrote the day before, always. The reason is editing is essentially pattern recognition, right? Oh, this sentence didn't quite work, but if I switch this word and this word, there's better rhythm, or there's blah, blah, blah. That's all pattern recognition stuff. So what I'm doing is I'm slowly amplifying the amount of dopamine in my system so that by the time I actually face the, I got to write 1,000 words today, blank page, right? I've already sort of closer to flow. There's more dopamine in my system. My creativity's turned up. So I've got complete concentration going. And my word count, how much do I write every day, is maximized to hit that challenge skills sweet spot. So I know that on any given day at the start of a novel or start of a book, 500 words a day is my goal. And the reason is I can write 350 words with my eyes closed, but to get from 350 words to about 500 words, at least in my writing style, you usually have to transition between ideas, and transitions are the hardest thing in writing to really do that well. So 500 words is actually a bitch, but it's not too much of a bitch, right? So when I start a book, it's 500 words a day, 500 or 600. Middle of the book, when I know more of what's going on and what I'm doing, it's 700 to 800 words a day. And the end of the book, it's 1,000 to 1,200 to 1,500 words a day, depending on how I'm feeling about the book and what my energy level is that day also, right? Because it goes up and down. And if I'm really freaking tired, 500 words is great. If I'm filled with energy, 650, right? Kind of thing. So it changes, you tune it. But so what am I doing to maximize flow? I've got a complete concentration. I've came in using a pattern recognition editing process that will amplify dopamine. I've tuned how much I'm going to write for my exact challenge, skill, balance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I do, plus the primary flow activity, plus, a handful of other things. But that's what I also, I like to start my day. I do a gratitude practice usually before I start writing. Like get to my office, make coffee, and while the coffee is brewing, do a gratitude practice. Because it lowers anxiety levels. It ups the amount of novelty the brain has access to. It tilts perception. And as a writer, where you want novelty means fodder for creative ideas. So gratitude practice really helps. And we also did some work with Glenn Fox at USC, who's a great gratitude researcher, who found we found that regular gratitude practices tend to correlate with high flow lifestyles. So we see a strong correlation between gratitude practices and flow. We were going to do way more studies on it, but we got COVIDed. So all our studies got parked. We had a great gratitude and flow research protocol all set up, ready to kick off last April. And we've been shut down. But we'll rebuild it this year.
There's all this different practical ways to do gratitude. I was just curious how you guys were going to research it.
So, I can tell you how we're going to research it. I can also, so a lot of people like write 3 things and turn one into a paragraph. That's the positive psychology version. They use that one the most. I personally like to write 10 things I'm grateful for by hand. Hands is very important for a bunch of different neurobiological reasons. And I write each one 3 times. So I'm happy and grateful that I feel healthy today. I write it out 3 times, and I'll have a sheet of paper with 30 lines on it, and then I just I don't have a fancy gratitude notebook. I throw it out every day. It's like my to-do list and my gratitude list gets made up in, and I throw it out. So it's not fancy to me, but to me, it's very foundational because it tunes the nervous system so well.
Does mindset have a lot to do with flow in general? You talk about just gratitude, obviously setting yourself. but it could be negative mindset.
Anthony, when you say mindset, do you mean what psychologists mean, attitude towards learning, or do you mean attitude towards life?
I would say probably towards life, like negative self-talk, things like that.
So when we talk about the challenge skills balance, there's been a lot of work done over the past 10, 15 years to figure out, well, what the fuck do we mean by challenge and skills? Okay, great, right? What does that actually mean? And it turns out there's like now 8 or 9 different things that those words actually mean. Confidence and optimism both play a role, and they play a big role, right? So you don't want to be overly confident, you don't want to be overly optimistic, but really good confidence and optimism help because they keep anxiety levels lower, and they do a bunch of good stuff about how we access our skills and whatnot. So it's very useful for that stuff. And in terms of mindset, optimism and confidence, those things are important. You can now often that, we train people to be better at the things that they do. We like real optimism and real confidence, right? So like based on actual real stuff in the world, nothing improves confidence and optimism and mindset more than, multiple successes, small victories over and over and over again, that kind of momentum. That's really, so you can tune mindset with gratitude. You can tune mindset with some breath work and mindfulness practices and things like that. But to really permanently, change it, I think you actually need real world successes.
Interesting. So one of my other flow states is playing music. I have a bunch of guitars hanging up right next to this monitor. Anytime I'm distracted throughout the day, I usually just play something, get into a little bit of a flow, go back to work.
Yep.
But this year, I've actually taken this course on writing music and trying to get better. It's almost like destroyed my flow, because now every time I pick up my guitar, I'm thinking like, okay, like what chord shape do I want to go to here? And I'm like thinking through, and it's become far more of a cerebral task for me. So is there like a step thing with learning and skill acquisition, or like, okay, you're in this learning phase, and once you get that locked in with new skills, then you're back into a flow state? Or like, how have you seen that in research?
So this is such a hugely, I got to give you an answer that will sort of, I'll give you the 2 answers that I could talk about, but there's so many cool, interesting questions sort of built around this at deeper and deeper levels that I have to start out by saying, I'm going to give you an answer. These are right, but there's a lot of we don't know kind of stuff right on the edges that we're starting to poke at in really weird ways. But here's what I can tell you. One, as a general rule, so a bunch of years ago, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, godfather of flow psychology, and a Google mathematician sat down and tried to put a number on the difference between challenge and skills. How much greater should the challenge be than your skills get? And they came up with 4%. And it was a back of the envelope bullshit fun calculation that they thought of as a metaphor. And we took it and ran a ton of research on it. And I don't think there's any way to validate it. I can't, but everybody found that it was the right number. Like, I can't tell you it's anything better than a metaphor, but everything we ran, we got amazing results. And what we got was, when you're only pushing 4% greater, you don't plateau. What you're asking is there a way around the plateau, right? Because normally what happens is, for example, let's get out of music for a second, into like action sports is really easy. Ski season, start of a ski season, you'll see skiers get into a bunch of flow early on. And this is what happens when you get back used to the feeling of skiing and the speed of skiing and whatever. And what you end up getting is early flow that is like an experience of where you're going to be able to go once you sort of onboard all those necessary skills without the flow, right? And then once you onboard those skills, you'll drop into another flow state and, get your sort of next target out. That's a normal learning plateau. That's a normal pattern for a lot of people in action sports. And it seems to be in athletes with seasons, right? Tennis season or whatever. Similar. We found that if you try to aim for that 4% sweet spot, you don't tend to plateau, and you keep learning, you keep learning, you keep learning. Now that's tricky for peak performers, 4% is just outside your comfort zone, right? So if you're meek, shy, not risk averse, you're going to dislike it because you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and you're going to be uncomfortable. But for type A hard chargers, the problem is they take on challenges that are 30%, 40%, 50% greater because it'll hold your attention, right? And it's just, this is fun. And I get it. And the research is great about high hard goals, right? It says, look, set a high hard goal. You'll get an 11 to 25% boost in motivation simply for setting high hard goals. Just make sure the shit you're doing today is in that 4% sweet spot. What I would, what listening to you, and I have no idea, but I would guess you trained up a bunch of cognitive stuff that is not yet automatized. So every time you're still seeing it, you're having to think about it. If you would have trained up 4% at a time, you would have learned a couple of notations at once. You know what I mean? Gotten those, layered those in, and then moved on and moved on. But you overloaded your working memory. You're basically overloading your working memory every time you're trying to play, and so you can't get access to the automatized behavior. So there's you're nowhere until you can automatize more of the kind of cognitive stuff that you've layered in. It's gonna keep, right, you're gonna keep bumping into this. So what I would tell you, you might want to experiment with is chunk down your approach to practicing. So the thing that you're playing, there's some of that, oh, what does this mean? Right? But not like, you know what I mean? Not a full suite. And I'm not a musical guy. Though on my list of things to learn this year is to learn to play the piano. So maybe by the end of the year I will be, but I don't play an instrument. I'm particularly bad at them. I've tried to play a lot of them and it hasn't worked. So but I'm deeply committed to being terrible for a really long period of time to win this year.
Yeah. I mean, I played for 15, 17 years, and it's like, I was at this plateau state, but getting flow out of it. And so it's been frustrating to go, like you said, probably in the grit stage of, I just need to slow down.
And so what I would tell you is dial it back. So I'll give you let me give you an example again from skiing, because it's really funny, but we have to do this with athletes a lot. You'll go out and with a group of athletes and start doing really gnarly stuff. And if it's not if people are not in flow, the secret is back the fuck off. Go ski like blue stuff, just really creatively. So what I would tell you to do is like start playing stuff that you can play blindfolded in your sleep, but just trying to be mildly creative on top of it. Right. I'm going to play I'm going to play Hotel California, which I probably learned when I was 10 years old. And I'm going to improv on this one little bit and nothing else. Right. Like that's where and just start there and just sort of build it up. But like, I would tell you, you're probably going to find the most flow. And I don't know, right, at all. Like, run the experiment. Don't take my word for it. Run the experiment yourself. But I would tell you that backing off a little bit on this one is probably going to help if your goal is more flow. And for me, I don't learn well when I'm frustrated. Flow is almost a requirement for me to learn well. I'm actually a very slow learner. So I'm constantly having to back off because I will bite off way more than I can chew. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there's grit required in the backing off, like you said before, around same thing.
Oh yeah.
Recovery.
No, it's the hardest thing I had to learn, like as, especially as an athlete, was that progress came from doing less, not more. And the way we explain it when we talk about this, and this isn't everywhere in peak performance, but I think in specific spots, you have to go slow to go fast, because the biology isn't designed to go fast in the point, you know what I mean? Like where you're trying to step on the gas, you're working against yourself rather than for yourself. So for example, quick example from my new book, The Art of Impossible. The book's about flow, but it's also about all the other things you need to support flow. And it starts off with motivation. How do you cultivate intrinsic motivation, which is curiosity, passion, purpose, a couple other things like that. And a lot of people are very frustrated because they don't know how do I find passion? What am I passionate about? How do I find my purpose? All that stuff. And it's actually that I can tell you, right? In fact, I can give your listeners, go to thepassionrecipe.com, and that's the beginning of Art of Impossible. That's the whole stuff there that's in that book for this. But the thing I always tell people is go slow, right? The way this is, the the way our biology is designed to turn curiosity into passion and passion into purpose, this doesn't happen overnight, and it's not designed to happen overnight, and it won't happen overnight. And you really want to go slow here, because there is nothing worse than being 2 years into your passion to discover, oh shit, it was a phase, right? I don't really want to be a dinosaur anthropologist. And that's really demotivating. That's awful, right? Having to reboot and start over from something like that. So there are places where it's really, really, really advantageous to slow down. But the problem, as you pointed out right when we started, is this stuff works like compound interest. So you're slowing down, and you know what I mean? Like, how many times do you have to go play basketball without feeling guilty before you start getting the results you're going to get from your basketball without feeling guilty? And will they show up fast enough to relieve your guilt? You know what I mean? Like, those are hard, real psychological problems that peak performers have to deal with all the time because of this very thing.
Is this possible to achieve when people are super stressed out? Maybe they got their job yanked from them over the last year. Times are tough.
So,
there's like a Maslow's hierarchy of need.
Yeah, what I tell people. So, I'll try to do this quickly, but there's a suite of tools that are known as the positive psychology basics. These are literally 30 years of positive psychology have said, hey, we got 6 things. So I always say, if you really got your ass kicked, right, and you're hyper vigilant, you need to bounce back, double down on your primary flow activity. It's the first place to start. Put an active recovery protocol into place. So this means, not passive recovery. You're done working TV and a beer. You're done working, and you're going to go for a 20-minute walk. You're going to do 20 minutes of restorative yoga. You're going to do something that actually actively lowers cortisol and norepinephrine levels. And then you have to pay attention to the positive psychology basics. These are the basics. There's 3 things that they say you should do for energy levels, and there's 3 things that you should do for anxiety or brain, cognitive stuff. And on the energy side, it's obvious. We need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. So that's one. And it's not really a choice. We don't there's very little, there's a lot of people that are like, I can get by on 5, I can get by on, and actually, no, the studies show you can't. And the study, especially from cognitive high performance, it's not really possible over time. So 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, good hydration, good nutrition. And I think everybody's individual. So that means something different probably for everybody. That's the second one. And then on the physical side, social support really matters for a lot of different reasons. But just think about, you get into a fight with your friend, your boss, your spouse, your mom. How tired are you at work the next day? How much is taken out of you? That's all you need to know. It goes for that, beyond that. So we try to ask people to make sure they get a couple hours of high quality, active listening, close listening, kind of social interaction with people who love you every week. That's on the physical side. And what I normally tell people is, if life's going okay, you can probably screw one of those up once a day. Probably can't do it every day in a row. But if you didn't get enough sleep last night and you still want to drop into flow at work the next day, if you nail hydration and nutrition, you've got good social support, you'll probably be able to produce the energy, right, for states of peak performance and flow. But if you're in a crisis, you got to do all 3 every time. You can't really screw that one up too much. And then on the cognitive side, the 3 best things you can do kind of to lower anxiety levels and train, that is a daily gratitude practice, 5 minutes long, mindfulness, respiration, breath work, mindfulness, 11 to 20 minutes is all the research shows you need a day to sort of tune your nervous system. And you can really do it with about 11 minutes a day, as long as you're consistent with it over time, or 20 to 40 minutes with exercise, right? And if you're exercising for cognition, you're exercising until you experience what's technically known as exercise-induced transient hypofrontality. And what really means it gets quiet upstairs, right? And when it gets quiet upstairs, by the way, and your lungs start to open up, that's a global release of nitric oxide. That's the same thing that's the front end of a flow state. And that you're basically flushing stress hormones out of your system. So what I tell people is, under normal conditions, do 1 a day. Do a gratitude practice, or do an 11-minute mindfulness practice, or get 20 to 40 minutes worth of exercise, right? During crises, during a serious, during COVID, do 2 or 3 a day because you're running really hot. So if you've had a terrible year, primary flow activity, positive psychology basics, active recovery protocol. That's where I start everybody, those things.
Those are all the foundations that I always chat about, like 4 pillars of health for me are nutrition, movement, sleep, and then stress, which sort of buckets in dynamics with other relationships. So
yeah. So I mean, this is what I mean. The positives I got, like, and by the way, let's be clear on something. When people read The Art of Impossible, which is the full how-to primer, that on this stuff, peak performers, the experience is exactly what you just had, which is, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, I'm doing this. I didn't know I needed to do this. And I didn't know this worked this way and connected with this. But because it's our biology and there's just a limited, right? There's a limited set of things. If you're anywhere near the top of your game, these are the things you have to be doing because this is how the system is designed to work. So your 4 pillars, of course, you know what I mean? Like, yes, makes sense because you're optimizing your biology and there's nothing, right, more or less than these particular things. And there's, probably a handful of things on either side of it that, go through a book like Art of Impossible, you're like, oh, cool. I didn't know this one was in here or whatever. You know what I mean?
Well, Steven, thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise today. Where can people find the new book?
The artofimpossible.com, theartofimpossible.com. Amazon will get it to you. StevenKotler.com is me. If you're interested in the passion recipe, we talked about it. That's passionrecipe.com. And if all the flow stuff, flowresearchcollective.com.
All right. Thank you, Steven.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for your interest.